I never imagined that the happiest day of my daughter's life would become the most humiliating day of mine. One moment, I was wiping tears as she walked down the aisle. The next, she was standing in front of us, eyes cold, voice raised, telling us to leave because her new husband didn't want us there. My husband and I walked out without arguing, our hearts breaking with every step, realizing that somewhere along the way we had lost our daughter to someone else's control. But fate has a strange sense of timing. Because the very next morning, she called cheerful and entitled, asking for the keys to our beachfront mansion in California for her honeymoon. Before I could respond, my husband quietly took the phone from my hand and spoke 5 calm words that changed everything. That was the moment our lives and hers stopped running on blind love and started running on truth. My name is Margaret Rowley, and I am 63 years old, and I truly believed this would be one of the happiest days of my life. I sat there in the decorated hall, watching my only daughter walk down the aisle, remembering the nights I stayed awake when she was a child, the scraped knees I kissed, the tears I wiped away. Everything sparkled, the lights, the flowers, the smiles, yet something inside my chest felt strangely heavy. I kept brushing it aside, telling myself this was simply emotion. But as the ceremony went on, I noticed the small things. The way her new husband squeezed her hand before she spoke. The way her eyes kept searching his face before responding. Love can blend into control so quietly that mothers only notice when it's already too late. At first, it was only subtle gestures. He rarely left her side, whispering into her ear as if guiding her every answer. Whenever someone spoke to her, he would step slightly forward, as though filtering the world on her behalf. She laughed, but it never quite reached her eyes. She stopped smiling whenever he looked away. A few relatives whispered about how protective he seemed, but to a mother's heart, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like possession wrapped in charm. Still, she said nothing. Weddings are meant for blessings, not doubts, even when those doubts refused to leave. As the evening continued, the whispers between them grew longer, sharper, and more urgent. He leaned close, speaking through gritted teeth while still wearing a picture-perfect smile for the crowd. She nodded obediently, trying to look relaxed, but her shoulders were tense, rigid, trapped between duty and discomfort. Every few minutes their eyes flickered toward the parents, table, cold, assessing, as though preparing for something. A storm was forming in silence, and everyone else was too busy dancing to notice. But a mother always notices the change in her child, even when she pretends not to. Then, without warning, it happened. She walked up with him beside her, her face pale but voice raised enough for the guests to hear. The words landed like stones. They were being asked to leave because he didn't want them there anymore. No discussion, no explanation, no kindness, just rejection, public, merciless, final. The room froze, some guests stared, others looked away in shame. The pain didn't come like a slap. It came like a slow shatter, the realization that the child she raised was choosing someone else's comfort over her parents' existence. The hall felt suddenly enormous, every light too bright, every gaze too sharp. Shame crept up her spine as she felt hundreds of eyes measuring the worth of a mother now deemed unwanted. She wanted to scream, to ask why, to demand even a shred of humanity, but dignity held her still. Tears pressed behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of those who believed she deserved this. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet refusal to break where others can see. So they turned and walked out, hearts heavy, backs straight, hands tightly clasped together like they had been on the first day they promised to face life as one. No accusations, no bitterness, just silence, the kind that aches more than any words ever could. Outside, the night air felt colder than she remembered. The music continued inside as though nothing had happened. She realized then that love, when twisted, can exile the very people who built the world you now stand on. Sleep never arrived that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her daughter's life, searching desperately for the point where everything had gone wrong. Was she too soft, too forgiving, too loving? The questions clawed at her chest while the house echoed with unspoken grief. Dawn crept in quietly, painting the sky gold, but inside everything still felt gray. She didn't yet know that the next morning would bring a phone call, one that would expose just how entitled betrayal can become. Morning sunlight filled the kitchen, but the warmth never reached her heart. She sat with a cup of untouched tea, replaying the humiliation over and over, when suddenly the phone rang. The caller ID showed the same daughter who had thrown them out only hours earlier. Her voice sounded sugary, almost cheerful, as if the previous night had never happened. She chatted lightly about the wedding, about how perfect everything had been, and for a moment the mother wondered if she had imagined the pain. But beneath that practiced sweetness lived something else, entitlement, polished and confident. There was no apology, no hesitation. Just a daughter calling her parents as if they were resources, not human beings whose hearts were still bleeding from the night before. Soon, the real reason for the call slipped out, She wanted the keys to the beachfront mansion so she and her new husband could spend their honeymoon in luxury. No emotion, no gratitude, just expectation. As if being publicly discarded should be forgotten the moment she needed something. The mother listened quietly, stunned that love could be repackaged into a transaction so quickly. Every word carried the weight of assumption that parents would always endure disrespect silently because they loved too deeply to refuse. And for the first time, the mother realized that unconditional love had been mistaken for unconditional access. While the daughter spoke, the father sat nearby, listening without interrupting. His face didn't harden, his voice didn't rise, but the silence around him changed. It wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence of clarity. He had watched the woman he loved walk out of that wedding with tears trapped behind her dignity. He had held her hand while she tried to stay strong. And now, hearing their daughter speak so casually, so carelessly, something inside him shifted permanently. Love would remain, but tolerance had reached its final boundary. As the call went on, the daughter continued praising her new husband, speaking proudly about how he knew what was best and how she was better off without parental interference. Each sentence felt like a small knife, not because of anger, but because of how easily she dismissed the people who built the foundation beneath her life. She spoke about the mansion as if it were a hotel reserved for her convenience. There was no space in her voice for guilt, only certainty. And that certainty revealed something heartbreaking. In her world, love existed only when it served her. The mother tried to reply gently, but emotion tightened her throat. Before she could gather words, the father reached out and took the phone, not abruptly, not in anger, but with calm finality. He had spent a lifetime protecting his family, guiding gently, forgiving easily. But forgiveness does not erase disrespect. His decision wasn't born from rage, it was born from love for the woman beside him, whose heart had been trampled the night before. And in that moment, the balance finally shifted back where it belonged. The father waited until the room was completely still. Then, in a voice neither loud nor harsh, just calm, steady, unshakable, he spoke the 5 words that would echo longer than any argument. "You are not welcome here." No anger, no insult, just a boundary. He didn't justify it. He didn't negotiate. He simply stated a truth that had been ignored for too long. Love may be unconditional, but access to their lives was not. On the other end of the line, silence replaced entitlement. And for the first time, the daughter realized that actions carry consequences. The daughter's voice finally returned, but it sounded different now. Shaken, confused, as if the world had tilted in a direction she didn't recognize. She tried to laugh it off, then tried demanding, then finally tried guilt, but none of it worked. Calm boundaries are immune to manipulation. The mother watched quietly, tears filling her eyes, not from pain this time, but from relief. For years, they had allowed disrespect to pass as immaturity. Now, the line had finally been drawn, and this was only the beginning. On the other end of the line, the daughter went silent for several seconds, stunned that the parents she once controlled so easily had finally said no. Then the silence cracked and anger poured through. Her voice sharpened, accusing, disbelieving, almost offended that boundaries even existed. She demanded an explanation, demanding to know how they could ruin her honeymoon over something so small. To her, public humiliation was forgettable, but being denied luxury was unforgivable. The mother listened quietly, her heart aching not from the insults, but from the realization that this was who her child had allowed herself to become. Not cruel by accident, cruel by comfort. Soon, the son-in-law joined the call, voice dripping with authority he had never earned. He spoke as though the mansion already belonged to them, as though the parents were tenants denying access to their landlords. He demanded the keys, insisting the house was basically part of the family now. The entitlement was so loud it almost drowned out the heartbreak, but the father remained steady. Calm, unmoved. Manipulation only works when someone is willing to bend, and bending was no longer an option. With the patience of a man who refuses to argue with delusion, the father explained the simple reality: the mansion belonged solely to them. It had been built through decades of sacrifice, long before the son-in-law ever appeared. There were legal documents, ironclad ownership. And no matter how many demands or threats were made, access was a privilege, not a right. The words landed heavily. For years, they had allowed assumptions to replace boundaries. Today, assumptions finally lost their power. The daughter tried to argue, but arguments collapsed quickly when placed beside facts. Slowly, painfully, she realized she had no legal standing, no authority, no claim. The life of comfort she believed she was entitled to had never actually been hers. It belonged to the parents she had just discarded in front of an entire wedding hall. And in that moment, panic began to replace arrogance. Because control feels strong until truth removes the foundation beneath it. As the call dragged on, the mother's mind drifted backward to the years of small indulgences, the yes answers given too quickly, the excuses made for selfish behavior. birthday demands that sounded more like orders, disrespect disguised as honesty. Time's generosity had been expected rather than appreciated. They had raised a child with love, but somewhere along the way, love had been mistaken for endless permission. The realization hurt because some heartbreak is handcrafted across years, not moments. For the first time, the parents admitted quietly to themselves and to each other that they had helped create this version of their daughter. Not intentionally, not carelessly, but by loving without boundaries, forgiving without reflection, and giving without requiring respect in return. They hadn't failed as parents, but they had been too afraid to say no. And now, no was the only word left strong enough to save what remained of their own dignity. Backed into a corner where entitlement could no longer protect her, the daughter lashed out. She accused them of being selfish, unloving, unforgiving, every word meant to wound them back into submission. But this time, the words didn't work. Because when boundaries are built from truth, manipulation loses its teeth. The mother listened with tears in her eyes, not because she doubted the decision, but because love sometimes hurts the most when it finally stands up for itself. The first consequence wasn't loud, it was administrative. Access to the beachfront mansion was formally blocked. Security codes changed. Keys deactivated. Legal notices updated to ensure no loophole remained. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouting matches, no emotional pleas. Just calm, final boundaries replacing years of blurred lines. The mother felt both heartache and relief. Heartache because this was never the future she imagined. Relief because for once, their kindness wasn't being used as a weapon against them. The father handled everything with quiet precision, protecting their home not out of spite, but out of long overdue self-respect. And somewhere miles away, a honeymoon fantasy crumbled before it even began. Weddings may end, but wedding gossip travels fast. Guests slowly began to learn the truth, not through rumors, but through the calm version shared by those who had witnessed everything. People who once admired the son-in-law's confidence now began to question it. The story of how parents were thrown out, and then immediately used for resources, painted a picture that stripped away charm and revealed entitlement. The daughter tried to reshape the narrative, but sincerity carries a tone that lies can't imitate, and the truth started finding its own voice. Without stage lights or an admiring crowd, the son-in-law's true nature began to show. Annoyance replaced patience. Demands replaced affection. He spoke about the mansion as if it were stolen from him, not something he'd never owned. His frustration wasn't about the parents' feelings, it was about losing access to luxury. Control thrives on convenience. Now that convenience was gone, the mask loosened. And the daughter finally began to notice the shift, not because she wanted to, but because ignorance was no longer comfortable. The carefully crafted dream she had built, the perfect marriage, the powerful husband, the endless resources began to crack. Little arguments surfaced. Tension lingered longer. Silence replaced laughter. She had imagined marriage as elevation, not realizing she'd climbed by standing on the backs of those who loved her most. Now, stripped of unearned privilege, she faced the reality beneath the decorations. Love based on control doesn't breathe well when boundaries appear. And slowly, painfully, the fantasy began to suffocate. What was meant to be a week of bliss turned into a battlefield of blame. He was criticized, she defended, he demanded, she panicked. The mansion had become more than a house, it had become a symbol of access, status, and ego. Without it, resentment surfaced. He accused her of losing influence. She replayed the moment she'd thrown her parents out, and the echo grew louder each time. Happiness can't survive in spaces where respect doesn't live. And respect had been missing for a very long time. Meanwhile, the parents chose silence over spectacle. They didn't post. They didn't gossip. They didn't retaliate. They simply went on with their days, reading, walking by the ocean, sitting together in the quiet comfort of shared strength. Their dignity didn't shout. It existed. And its existence alone was more powerful than any revenge could ever be. The mother still loved her child. Nothing could erase that, but love no longer meant sacrificing herself. Eventually, the phone rang again, but this time, the voice on the other end wasn't arrogant. It was trembling. The daughter's words broke between sobs as reality finally reached her heart. The marriage wasn't a fairy tale. The control wasn't protection. And the people she had pushed away were the only ones who had ever loved her without expecting anything in return. She didn't ask for the mansion this time. She asked for something far more fragile, a chance to be heard. And for the first time since the wedding, the mother felt pain and hope exist together. Before we continue, tap like and subscribe, because the truth that's coming next is something every parent needs to hear. When she finally stopped crying, the words came slowly, apologies wrapped in regret, memories wrapped in shame. She admitted that she had been manipulated, that she had allowed someone else's voice to replace her own judgment. She confessed that the wedding incident had haunted her since the moment it happened. There was no pride left, no arrogance, just a frightened young woman realizing how far she had drifted from the people who had always loved her. The mother listened, not as a judge, but as someone whose heart had waited too long to hear honesty. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, real forgiveness takes time, but the door to it finally opened. And that alone felt like a miracle. While she softened, he hardened. The son-in-law's facade cracked completely once he realized the mansion and the control attached to it were gone forever. His charm turned sharp. His patience vanished. He blamed, criticized, demanded, as though love were something owed by contract. The daughter began to see what the parents had quietly sensed all along: control, not care, had shaped the marriage. And when control lost its grip, so did the relationship. Sometimes, truth is not discovered in arguments, but in silence. The silence after respect disappears. It didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in quiet conversations, late-night realizations, long pauses filled with fear and courage. She slowly accepted that love should never require abandoning the people who raised you, nor should it require abandoning yourself. Counselors were called, lawyers quietly consulted. Separation was not a threat, it became a possibility. She finally allowed herself to speak aloud. And for the first time in months, she breathed without permission. Heartbreak hurts, but healing always begins with the truth. When she finally came back to the family home, she didn't arrive as the entitled bride who once ordered them out. She arrived as a humbled daughter, suitcase in hand, apologies trembling on her lips, fear resting on her shoulders. The house didn't greet her with lectures. It greeted her with silence, warm food, and a place to sit while she rebuilt herself. Love didn't erase what happened, but it refused to abandon her now that she needed guidance instead of indulgence. The parents forgave, but this time, forgiveness came with boundaries. Respect was no longer optional. Access was no longer assumed, and love was no longer allowed to be twisted into obligation. They hugged her, prayed with her, and promised to stand beside her, not beneath her. She cried in their arms the way she once did as a child, finally understanding that protection and control are not the same. Real family doesn't cage you. It shelters you while you learn to stand again. The mansion, once seen as a prize, now stood simply as a symbol of wisdom. Legal protections stayed firmly in place. Ownership remained secure. Financial independence was safeguarded. The lesson had been learned the hard way: generosity without boundaries becomes a tool for abuse. Now, everything was clear, structured, and safe. And for the first time in a long while, the parents slept peacefully, knowing they had finally protected both their homes and their hearts. In the quiet days that followed, the mother reflected on everything they had survived. She still loved her daughter, that would never change. But she finally understood that love without boundaries turns into slow self-destruction. Parenting doesn't end when children grow up, it simply changes shape. Sometimes it means holding them. Sometimes it means letting go. And sometimes it means saying no with love strong enough to withstand the storm. Her final truth was simple: love your children deeply. But never give them the power to destroy your dignity.